Hey guys, it's me Mia and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to go over different types of watercolor paper that I've used and what I recommend for beginners. And the reason why I'm doing this video is because someone left a comment for me and they wanted to know which is better for beginners, cheap or expensive watercolor paper. So when I was learning how to use watercolor, I was on a very tight budget and I went to Michael's and I got cheap watercolor paper and cheap watercolor paint. And when I started experimenting, I wasn't getting the results that I wanted. And so I did some more research and I discovered that Arteza watercolor paper and Winsor & Newton watercolors would give me the results that I needed. So I splurged on those two items and I've been using them ever since. And it's not until recently that I started experimenting with other watercolor paper and watercolor paints. But before I get into the paper, there's 4 points that I want to make. The one is that the paper you get depends on your technique. If you're into wet on wet, lifting, masking fluid, salt, you're going to have to get a higher quality paper that can handle that. Usually higher quality means you'll have to pay a little more money, but it's worth it. Whereas if you try to do those same techniques on cheap watercolor paper, you're going to be very disappointed and you'll be mad that you wasted money. The second point is that 140 pound, 300 grams per square meter, that's the most common weight for watercolor paper, regardless of whether it's cheap or the expensive kind. And all that means is that the watercolor paper, it's thicker, a little bit sturdier, and it won't buckle as much. Now, it will still buckle, but not a lot. And if you want to keep your watercolor paper from buckling, I have 2 recommendations. One that I usually use is I just get a clipboard, preferably one bigger than this, and some painter's tape that I got from the dollar store, and I just tape the watercolor paper onto here, and that keeps the paper from buckling too much. Or another thing that I do is I get a watercolor block. So a watercolor block is just a bunch of papers that are sealed together on all 4 sides, and there's a small opening right here. So you paint your painting, the paper doesn't move, it doesn't buckle, nothing. And after the paint dries, you take a sharp object and then through the opening you can cut out the watercolor page and the page is flat. But we'll get more into that later. And let's see. The last, can't remember if that's number 3 or number 4. Well, last point I want to make is the quality of watercolor paint that you use makes a big difference. Try not to get cheap, chalky watercolor paint because, I mean, they come in a variety of colors, but there's not a lot of pigment in them, and they're usually chalky, so you're not going to get the same vibrancy. So today, now, if you go on Amazon, you'll see all kinds of cheap watercolor sets, and some are better than others. I prefer, I recommend Miss You Love. That's a cheap watercolor set that I got. Colors are very vibrant, lots of pigment. So keep that in mind. So let's get started. So this is Strathmore, and I actually have 2 of these. I get one from Michael's because they're always on sale, and this other one I believe I got with a Palettefull Packs box. And I normally don't use this paper, but I wanted to try it out. And this is a hamburger that I painted. I used wet on wet. And as you can see, the paper does buckle a little. But I noticed the pages in here, some of them kind of fall out. But you don't have to get it in this format. You can also get it in a ringed pad that looks like this. And when I use this Strathmore paper, I just use it to experiment with. And here's some of the paintings that I've done. This is a watercolor swatch from another video. And these are just some little faces and designs that I did. So I just used Strathmore just to experiment with and play around. So would I recommend this for beginners? Yes, I would, but just for practice. If you're not afraid of making mistakes, then I would recommend this paper. And it holds up pretty well. This has a lot of layers in it, and I did wet on wet as well as some lifting, and it turned out great. So I recommend Strathmore just for experimenting, trying different techniques, and having fun. The next watercolor set, well, not watercolor set, watercolor paper is Grumbacher. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So I got this from Hobby Lobby last year. It was on clearance. So I said, let me grab this up. And I don't know if you guys can tell. It looks like it has texture to it, but it feels really waxy on top. Feels quite waxy. So I don't do anything extensive with this, but I have made little watercolor journals with this paper, and it's good for simple paintings, simple washes, nothing too fancy, because the paper's too waxy for me. So let's take a look in here. Okay, so this is a little painting that I did, and when I painted this, it just seemed like the water and the paint were just sitting on top of the paper. Let's see what else I did. Here's another painting I did. And then once again, like I said, I just felt like everything was just sitting on top of the paper, waiting to absorb. And that this texture feels like really waxy and smooth, despite the little bit of texture that you see. So would I recommend Grumbacher for beginners? That would be a maybe. Someone might like the waxy texture. They might like that the paint just sits on top of the paper and it gives them more time to manipulate the paint. So this is Artist Loft watercolor paper from Michaels, and I do not know why I bought this. This paper isn't that great. I said, well, I'll just use it for experimenting. Yeah, the paper's not that great. I did do some little practice illustrations on this before. Bring on the tulips, lobster tail. Yeah, I don't know why I got this paper. Would I recommend this for beginners? No, because this paper's really cheap. It's very cheap. And I don't think you'll like it. Here is the Hobby Lobby brand of watercolor paper. And Hobby Lobby, in case you didn't know, their art supplies are on sale every 2 weeks. Let me change that. Their Master's Touch and Master's Fine art products are on sale every 2 weeks, 50% off. So this was, what, $1.50 on sale. So the price is nice, but the watercolor isn't that great. Well, sorry, watercolor paper isn't that great to me. And I'll tell you why. So these are some little paintings that I did, and the paper just doesn't let me layer the paint like I want to. It was difficult doing wet on wet, and I used the tape to divide it into 6 different areas. And I'll show you what happened when I took the tape off this one. I don't know if you can tell, but the tape lifted off some of the papers. So you see a lot of pilling here and here. And then so some people like Hobby Lobby's watercolor paper. I don't. I just use it for swatches and experimenting. And that's pretty much it. But I don't recommend this paper for beginners. But use it to experiment and tear it up and have fun and then just throw it away. So the next watercolor paper that I've used is by Arteza, and I've done a review on this before. I think the watercolor paper is okay. One side is textured and the other is smooth. Now supposedly you're able to use both sides. I've used both sides for painting before, and I don't know what to say. I stopped painting. No, I didn't stop painting on both sides. But I pretty much use this just for practicing techniques. Now, I don't know if you guys can see, but when I use the watercolor paint on the smooth side of the paper, you can see some of the paper has lifted up. You see these little grains of paper? So the smooth side doesn't tolerate too many washes or other types of techniques. Okay, so here we go with Canson XL watercolor paper. And I believe I got this at Michael's. It was pretty cheap. I don't do anything too fancy with this type of paper because I've been using Artistik watercolor paper for so long. I just know if the paper's cheap, it's not going to hold up too well. So when I got this, I primarily got it for my watercolor recipe cards. So let's take a look. So here are my watercolor recipe cards on the Canson XL paper. This banana loaf right here, I used a ton of layers. And the paper didn't lift up at all. No pilling. And then right here is wet on wet technique. So some people don't like this paper for some reason. I think it's okay for beginners and I recommend it. However, I would only recommend getting just one. Preferably a notebook that you can experiment in. But I think if you want to use various techniques with this type of paper, you may want to go easy on that. This next brand, I think I did a review on them before. It's called Artistik Watercolour Pad, and I think it's a company in the UK. And I like this paper. I just use it for my watercolor swatches and doing little drawings. I haven't done anything fancy in here. And I got this in the 3-pack, and I can't remember how much it costs. But I went on Amazon today, and they don't even carry this type of paper anymore. So that's disappointing because this is really good for someone who wants to practice techniques in. And with these little fish and everything, and the coral reefs, I used a ton of paint, wet on wet. This is ink right here. And to keep the pages from buckling, I just used a binder clip. But if you have a chance to use this paper, then I recommend getting this, but only for practice. So right here, I have Arches watercolor paper, and this paper is great. And this is in a block, which means I can paint on it and the pages don't buckle. And this paper has quite a bit of texture in it. It's sturdy. It absorbs the water well. Not too fast, not too slow. And I highly recommend Arches. And I'll show you guys couple watercolor paintings I've done with Arches. So Arches is good watercolor paper to practice with, but it is quite expensive. So when I started practicing with watercolors, what I would do is I would get like a sheet of this Arteza watercolor paper, and I would just cut it into smaller pieces, and I would paint small paintings, and that was helpful, and I was able to save money because I wasn't always spending it on arches. This does cost quite a bit. But here are some paintings that I did with arches. And like I said, you can see some warping, buckling with the paper, but not too much because I had it taped on all four sides. So these are just a couple of old, very old paintings that I did using Winsor & Newton watercolor. So I told you guys that the best watercolor paper for you to practice on is arches. However, it's quite expensive. But I discovered an alternative. This is called Academy Watercolor Paper Pad, and I believe the company says Bao Hong, but I got this from Amazon. And how much did I pay for this? I can't remember how much I paid for this. Not a lot. But they don't carry this size anymore. This is 7 by 10.2 inches. But I briefly compared this to Arches watercolor paper before, and I showed you guys that the textures on both papers are very similar. So this is a painting that I didn't have a chance to finish yet, but just try to ignore it. But I want you guys to look at the texture. This is the Arches, and this is the Academy Watercolor Paper Pad. I find the textures to be very similar, and while painting on this, this reminded me of Arches watercolor paper. The quality just seemed so similar. But you get this, and it's not as expensive. So this is a watercolor block, and I'll show you like the gummed sides. And then here's the little opening. You can just slide a knife through to slide the page out. So, I highly, of all these papers, different types of papers that I've shown you, I really recommend this one for beginners. Why? Because you get the Arches quality, but you don't get the Arches price. Now, as I said before, Amazon, they don't have this particular size available right now, but they do have a larger size that's around, I think it's 15 by 10 inches, and it's around $25. And 15 by 10 inches, that's a pretty big size. So that's around $25, whereas this one here, you go on Dick Blick's website, you'll be charged around $29. So if you go on Amazon and decide to get the Academy Watercolor Paper Pad, the 15 by 10 inch for $25, you're getting a real deal. So I highly recommend this of all the papers. I recommend this for practice. I recommend this for doing final paintings on. I think it's a great paper to use. And let me show you guys some of the paintings that I've done using this Academy watercolor paper. I've done this, and this is using Daniel Smith watercolor. I've used a ton of water for this galaxy right here. And this is another painting I used a ton of water on. So I love this paper. I believe it's great. And I highly recommend that you get it. So anyway, you guys, that's it for the video. But just to wrap things up, Strathmore is good for practice. Grumbacher is good for practice. Hobby Lobby paper, don't bother. Arteza watercolor sketchbooks, for practice, yes. Artistik Watercolor Pad if you're lucky to find one. Good for practice. Yes. Arches. Absolutely yes. Academy Watercolor Paper Pad. Definitely yes. So I hope you guys found this video useful. If you have any questions or anything, any comments, just leave them below and I'll answer. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye!